It started like any ordinary day. My lecture hall was buzzing with the familiar sounds of students shuffling papers and whispering among themselves. At 50, with a career spanning nearly 3 decades as a university lecturer, I thought I'd seen it all. Yet, nothing prepared me for the spark that ignited when he walked in. Ethan, just another name on my roster, just another young face among dozens. But something about him was different. Maybe it was the confident stride, the way he carried himself with a maturity that belied his 22 years. Or those eyes, hazel, flecked with gold, and so intense they seemed to read the secrets I'd never dared to speak aloud. He was late, and as he slipped into the room, his presence stirred the air. My words faltered for a split second, but I recovered quickly, hiding my reaction behind the monotone delivery of Renaissance poetry. Still, I couldn't help but notice the subtle smirk on his lips when our eyes met briefly. Did he know? Could he feel the slight hitch in my composure? For the rest of the lecture, I was hyper-aware of him, the way he leaned forward, his hand lazily twirling a pen as if he wasn't just listening but absorbing every word I said. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long when I turned to write on the board. I could feel the heat rise to my cheeks, a sensation both foreign and thrilling. When the class ended, the students filed out as usual, but Ethan lingered. "Professor, your lecture was inspiring," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with something that made my pulse quicken. I managed a polite smile, reminding myself of the unspoken rules I'd always lived by. Yet, as I watched him leave, a quiet thrill curled in my stomach. For the first time in years, I felt alive in a way that both terrified and exhilarated me. It wasn't just Ethan's presence, it was the realization that perhaps, just perhaps, I wasn't done feeling this way. Something had shifted, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed blurred into a haze of routine lectures and faculty meetings, yet Ethan's presence lingered in my mind, like the faint scent of cologne on a borrowed scarf. I told myself it was ridiculous. He was a student, young enough to be my son. But logic seemed powerless against the quiet hum of excitement that filled me whenever I thought of him. Our next encounter was far from planned. I was in the university library, searching for a text to recommend to my graduate seminar. The space was nearly empty, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. I was lost in the rows of books when a familiar voice broke the silence. "Professor Monroe." I turned sharply, my heart skipping a beat. There he was, leaning casually against the end of the aisle, his eyes fixed on me with that same disarming intensity. "Ethan," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "What brings you here?" He shrugged, holding up a book on 17th century literature. "Trying to get ahead. Your lectures sparked my interest." There it was again, that subtle smirk, as if he knew exactly what he was doing to me. We exchanged a few words, a polite conversation about Milton and metaphors. But the charged energy between us was anything but academic. When he stepped closer, his arm brushing mine as he reached for a book, I felt my breath hitch. "Are you always this passionate about your students' success?" he asked, his tone light but with a trace of something deeper. My cheeks warmed, but I forced a chuckle. I try to encourage enthusiasm where I can. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Well, consider me very enthusiastic." The air between us felt thick, almost tangible. I should have stepped away, said something to diffuse the moment. But I didn't. Instead, I lingered, caught in his orbit, my pulse racing as his gaze held mine. When I finally walked away, my hands trembling around the book I didn't even need, I knew I was in trouble. I wasn't sure where this would lead, but a part of me didn't care. The next week, my resolve to maintain distance unraveled further. It was an unusually warm afternoon, and I decided to hold my seminar outdoors in the university's courtyard. The setting was idyllic. Students sprawled on the grass, the scent of blooming jasmine in the air. But my focus was fractured, and I knew exactly why. Ethan sat near the front, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, tanned forearms. His notebook was open, but his attention wasn't on it. No, his gaze was fixed on me, unwavering, bold. Every time our eyes met, it felt like an unspoken challenge, a dare to acknowledge the magnetic pull between us. I stumbled over my words. More than once, and when his lips curved into that knowing smile, I almost forgot how to breathe. After class, as the other students dispersed, Ethan stayed behind again. This was becoming a pattern, one that I couldn't seem to discourage despite every logical reason to do so. "Professor, may I ask you something?" he said, standing casually, his hands in his pockets. "Of course," I replied, my voice calm even as my pulse betrayed me. "How do you balance passion with discipline?" His words were innocent enough, but the way he said them made my stomach flutter. "Passion and discipline aren't mutually exclusive," I managed, my throat suddenly dry. "In fact, they often enhance one another." His eyes searched mine, and, for a moment, the world around us seemed to fade. "I think you embody that balance perfectly." I felt my cheeks flush, a rush of heat spreading through me. "Ethan, I hope you're not trying to flatter your way to a better grade," I teased, attempting to steer the moment back into safer territory. He grinned, leaning slightly closer. "Not at all, Professor. I think you've already inspired me in ways you can't imagine." His words lingered in the air, heavy with implications I couldn't ignore. My mind screamed at me to put an end to this, to draw a line. But as he turned to leave, his fingers brushing lightly against mine in an almost accidental touch, I knew I was already too far gone. The line, if it ever existed, was long behind us. It was late one evening when the inevitable happened. The university was quiet, the hallways dimly lit. As I sat in my office grading papers, a soft knock on the door startled me, and when I looked up, there he was. "Ethan, sorry to bother you so late, Professor," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to ask about my essay." His presence filled the small room, making it feel impossibly smaller. I cleared my throat, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course, let me grab it." As I shuffled through the stack of papers, I felt his eyes on me, the intensity of his gaze like a physical weight. My hands trembled slightly, and I cursed myself for the betrayal of composure. "I admire how much you care about your students," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "Not every professor is so invested." I placed his essay on the desk between us, forcing a professional tone. "It's important to me that you all succeed." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "You go above and beyond, Professor. It doesn't go unnoticed." The air in the room thickened, a tension sparking between us like a live wire. I should have dismissed him, should have said something to end this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I met his gaze, my heart pounding as silence stretched between us. His hand moved, slowly, hesitantly, until his fingers brushed against mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Tell me you don't feel it too." Everything inside me screamed. To pull away, to restore the boundary we were dangerously close to shattering. But as I looked into his eyes, a storm of emotions swirling there, I knew I couldn't lie. "I don't know what to do with this," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned closer, his face mere inches from mine. "Let me show you." And just like that, the world fell away. The moment lingered, suspended in the fragile tension between us. Ethan's breath warmed the space between us, and I felt my resolve waver, splintering under the weight of a desire I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. His fingers, rough yet deliberate, brushed mine again, sending a shiver racing through me. "Ethan, this," I started, my voice barely audible, unsure of whether I was protesting or inviting. He didn't let me finish. "I can leave," he murmured, his voice steady but laced with something vulnerable. "But if you don't want me to, say so." I should have told him to go, to walk away before the line between right and wrong vanished completely. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself meeting his gaze, my lips parting as I tried to summon a coherent thought. What came out was a whisper. "Stay." The word hung in the air like a fragile promise, and his eyes softened, his confidence blending with something almost reverent. He moved closer, closing the gap between us. I felt the heat radiating from his skin, the quiet energy that made my pulse race. "You're beautiful," he said softly, his voice raw with honesty, and it disarmed me completely. For the first time in decades, I felt truly seen, desired not out of obligation or habit, but simply for being me. I didn't stop him as his hand traced a line from my wrist to my shoulder, a touch that was both hesitant and electrifying. The room seemed to shrink, the world outside dissolving until it was just us, caught in a moment that felt as inevitable as the tides. And as his lips brushed mine, tentative yet certain, I surrendered to the rush, to the thrill, of feeling alive again, knowing there would be no turning back. The hours that followed were a blur of emotions, an entanglement of sensations I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. As we sat together, the room cloaked in shadows and quiet whispers, I felt both liberated and conflicted. Ethan's touch was tender yet insistent, every movement a reminder of the lines we'd crossed. When I finally pulled back, the weight of reality settled over me like an unwelcome guest. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly acutely aware of everything: the muted hum of the campus at night, the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hall, and the storm of emotions raging within me. This was unwise, I murmured, avoiding his gaze as I straightened my blouse, trying to restore some semblance of composure. Unwise, Ethan echoed, his voice low, yet warm. But did it feel wrong? His question caught me off guard, and I hesitated. It was the question I'd been asking myself ever since I let that first spark of attraction ignite into something more. Did it feel wrong? No, but did that mean it wasn't? It doesn't matter what it felt like, I said finally, standing to put some space between us. I have responsibilities, a life outside this office. And you have your whole future ahead of you. Ethan stood as well, his expression unreadable. I don't regret this, not a single second of it, he said, his voice steady. But if you want me to walk away, I will. My breath hitched at his words, at the simplicity of his offer. He wasn't asking for promises or permanence, only for permission to stay in the moment a little longer. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Ethan, I don't know what comes next. I just know that tonight, I needed this. I needed you. His hand found mine, his touch grounding me as we stood in the fragile quiet of my office. I knew this wasn't the end of the complications, the consequences, or the longing that tethered us together. But for now, for this fleeting moment, we existed in a space where nothing else mattered but the undeniable pull between us. The days after that night were a whirlwind of tension, exhilaration, and guilt. Every glance exchanged with Ethan in the lecture hall felt like a secret, a shared understanding hidden in plain sight. Yet, beneath the thrill was a gnawing unease that I couldn't ignore. I told myself it had to stop. I repeated it like a mantra, hoping it would somehow erase the magnetic pull I felt whenever he was near. But avoidance proved futile. Ethan seemed unshaken, his confidence only emboldened. He didn't press, didn't corner me, but his presence alone was enough to unsettle my carefully curated world. It was on a rainy afternoon, as the students hurried out of the building, that he caught me alone again. I was locking my office door, my mind cluttered with thoughts of boundaries I'd already failed to keep, when I turned to find him standing there, drenched but unconcerned. "Professor," he said softly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I think we need to talk." The firmness in his voice disarmed me. "Ethan, this isn't," I began, but he cut me off with a shake of his head. "I'm not here to make this harder for you," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But I can't pretend that night didn't change something. For both of us." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. My rational mind screamed at me to walk away, to remind him, and myself, of the boundaries we'd breached. But my heart, my traitorous heart, ached at the thought of letting go. "What do you expect me to do, Ethan?" My voice was barely above a whisper, strained with the conflict tearing me apart. He stepped closer, his voice soft but certain. "Just tell me how you feel. Be honest, even if it's not what I want to hear." I hesitated, my breath catching as his hand brushed mine, grounding me in a way I couldn't ignore. "I feel alive," I admitted finally, the truth spilling out like a confession. "But I don't know if that's enough." "It's enough for me," he murmured, and as his words hung in the air, I knew this was far from over. The storm inside me only grew stronger as the days passed. Every moment I spent in Ethan's presence felt like a betrayal to the life I'd built, yet it awakened something I hadn't realized I'd lost. I couldn't reconcile the woman I was, responsible, composed, with the one who longed to let go, to surrender to the thrill of feeling wanted again. It was late one evening, long after the campus had emptied for the night, when I found myself back in my office. The glow of my desk lamp was the only light in the room as I attempted to focus on grading papers. But my thoughts kept drifting, and my hand trembled slightly as I marked a student's essay. A knock on the door startled me. I already knew who it was before I even looked up. Ethan. He stepped inside, his damp hair glistening from the evening rain, his expression unreadable but intense. "I couldn't leave things like this," he said softly, closing the door behind him. I stood, my breath catching. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this." "Why not?" he asked, his voice firm but without accusation. "Tell me why, and I'll walk away. But if you can't, stop fighting this." His words hit me with the force of a wave, pulling me under. I turned away, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk as I tried to compose myself. "This isn't fair to you, or to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're risking too much." "I'm not afraid of risks," he said, moving closer. "I'm afraid of not taking them." The warmth of his presence behind me was undeniable. When his hand brushed my arm, it sent a shiver through me. "Tell me you don't want this," he said, his voice low and insistent. "And I'll leave." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. I should have told him to go. I should have ended it then and there. But, instead, I whispered, "I can't." And in that moment, I surrendered again, drawn to him like a moth to a flame, knowing I was bound to burn. The days blurred into a dangerous dance of stolen moments and whispered words. I told myself each time would be the last, but the pull of Ethan's presence made that promise impossible to keep. In his company, I felt stripped of the weight of years and obligations. He looked at me like I was his entire world, and for a time, I let myself believe it. It was one evening in particular that would be etched into my memory. The university was deserted, the air thick with the anticipation of an approaching storm. Ethan and I had stayed late, under the guise of reviewing his thesis proposal. The library was quiet, its walls lined with rows of books that seemed to hold our secrets. We sat at a small table in a secluded corner, papers spread between us. I tried to focus on his writing, to keep the conversation professional, but his proximity was intoxicating. The scent of his cologne, the way his voice dipped when he asked a question, it was a sensory overload I couldn't escape. "Professor," he said suddenly, breaking my train of thought. His use of the title felt deliberate, a reminder of the line we'd already crossed. "Why do you keep holding back?" I looked up at him, my pen frozen mid-note. "Ethan, we've talked about this. There are consequences. Do you regret it?" he asked, leaning forward. His gaze was so intent, so raw, that it stole the breath from my lungs. "No," I admitted, the word escaping before I could stop it. "But that doesn't make it right." His hand reached for mine across the table, his touch warm and grounding. "What if it's not about right or wrong? What if it's about what we feel?" I swallowed hard, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within me. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, sending a spark straight through me. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he said, his voice a whisper. "But if you don't." I didn't. Instead, I leaned into the inevitability of it all, allowing myself one more indulgence in the chaos he brought into my life. The storm outside raged as if mirroring the chaos within me. Ethan's hand lingered on mine, his touch a tether pulling me deeper into this forbidden space we'd created. My heart thundered in my chest, every beat reminding me of the line I should have drawn long ago but hadn't. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of rain battering the windows. "How to stop feeling this way." His gaze softened, a mixture of patience and quiet intensity. "Maybe you don't have to," he said. His words weren't coaxing, not a demand, but an invitation, a freedom I wasn't sure I deserved. He stood, moving to my side of the table. I should have pulled away, should have said something, to shatter the fragile tension building between us. But I couldn't, not as his fingers traced a gentle line along my jaw, tilting my face up toward his. "Ethan," my voice faltered, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his steady gaze. "You make me feel alive," he murmured, his words echoing my own unspoken truth. "Like I can't breathe when you're not near." It was reckless, selfish even, but in that moment, the rules didn't matter. All I could focus on was the warmth of his hand against my skin, the way his thumb brushed the corner of my mouth. Slowly, tentatively, he leaned in, and I let him. His kiss was tender, hesitant, but it ignited a fire that threatened to consume me. It wasn't just the thrill of something new, it was the way he made me feel seen, as though I wasn't a professor or a middle-aged woman but someone deserving of this passion. The rain hammered harder against the windows as I surrendered once more, letting the storm carry us away. I knew this couldn't last, that reality would inevitably intrude. But for now, wrapped in the warmth of Ethan's arms, I let myself exist in this moment, untethered, unapologetic, and utterly alive. Thank you for being with me until the end. Like and subscribe to Nasty Talks.